So we're going to start with a bit of an introduction from me, very short, just 10 minutes. I'm afraid I've had a cough the whole week, so hopefully I won't dissolve into coughing in the middle. And if I do, I might have to hand over to someone else. But I'll start with a bit of an introduction, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Nikki. Nikki works for APRS, and she specialises in our planning work and also our national parks work. And she'll give us an overview of the planning system as it pertains to data centres and what you can expect and the timing. And then we'll pass to Ben Christman of ERCS, that's the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland, who will be looking more into the sort of detail of the legal aspects and environmental impact assessments and things like that. And then there'll be time for questions. So we've got some questions that you've sent in already, which I'll make sure get answered. But also, if there's other questions, please do put them in the chat as we're going. If you put a little question mark at the beginning, we'll be able to find them a bit easier. So I'm going to just try and share my screen. This wasn't the most easy thing last time, but hopefully it's going to work this time. Here we go. View, slideshow. There we are. Right. So I'm just going to start with a really quick sort of overview of what we mean by data centers, hyperscale data centers. So we're looking really specifically at hyperscale data centers, which are usually extremely big. They don't have a size. Over time, they've been growing so much, and the size of them been growing that before a hyperscale data center would have perhaps been 20 megawatts, and now it's considered to be much higher than that. And the ones that we're seeing coming to Scotland, as you know, are more than 200 megawatts. So size sort of is just expanding all the time, so it's difficult to measure it by that. But it's usually a hyperscale data center is occupied by one of the hyperscalers, meaning the big tech companies like Microsoft, like Google, like OpenAI, etc. And they are often processing AI, especially in Scotland, and we'll look into that in a minute, why that is. So this is just a diagram that I've taken, which is an illustration of the answer to a parliamentary question that was given in 2024. It was a 2025 parliamentary question, and this is data from 2024 that was gathered by the UK government on what was the capacity of data centres in the UK. And this shows the dominance of London. So you can see that over a gigawatt of the data centre at current, let's say this is from 2024, so things have changed a bit since then, but it's roughly current. London is extremely skewed towards the data centre market. This is because originally a lot of data centres would need to be near places where, you know, there was banking, there was the institutions, and they needed to have what they call low latency, which means, you know, the tiniest amount of time, even at the speed of light, that data travels to get to the banks to make transactions and things like that. So hence the enormous number of them near to London. And you can see there in the blue, Scotland. So the estimate from the UK government was that Scotland had 30 megawatts of data centres. And this is co-location data centres in 2024. Co-location data centres are where it's not owned by, let's say, a company or the NHS or a bank. It's actually owned by a third party, and the space within that is rented by other organisations, and that can be cloud computing, but it can also be rented by specific companies. So that's the co-location data market. This is in Scotland, so they estimate 30 megawatts. At the same time, the Scottish government, in a Freedom of Information request, estimated 10 megawatts was in Scotland, but this is the largest data centre we think that there is in Scotland. It's Data Vita, which is in Chapel Hall. We went out to visit it last week because obviously it's also the site of the AI growth zone in Lanarkshire. And you can see it's a sort of moderately compact industrial building. We think this is around 23 megawatts, and they're currently building an extension. Here it is. They're taking down some oak trees there to build this extension, which will take up to 40 megawatts. However, there's the AI growth zone will make it a lot bigger. But let's have a look at what's coming into Scotland at the moment. So this diagram here, it's 1,450 megawatts for the whole UK. And let's shrink that down a bit. So keep that in mind. You can see Scotland, that little blue square. Now, here's what we have in the planning system and in pre-planning in Scotland at the moment. So it's about 4.5 times what was estimated for 2024. And it's a very lot larger than what was estimated for Scotland, as you can see. It's also about 1.5 times that the maximum energy capacity of Scotland's grid at the moment in a peak delivery of energy in Scotland in a sort of January tea time is around 4,000 megawatts, but it can go up to 5,000 megawatts in some years. So we're talking about a huge increase in this. And where's this coming from? Well, it's coming from AI. And this is because it's no longer important for data centers to be so close to where things are happening, i.e. London or New York or whatever, Washington. They can, because they're processing large amounts of AI data, just churn away in the background, and latency is not such an issue. So what's more important is access to power and access to land and access to water. And so, of course, places with cheap land and that have a perceived access to water and energy are really, really important. Hence, this sort of interest in Scotland. So we've done a map, you might have seen it, it's on our website, which gives the sort of best idea that we've got of where these data centres are coming into planning systems. Now, we can only just keep an eye on it with the help of other people. So if you know of any that we've missed, please do let us know. We were made aware this week of one that is being discussed in Dumfries and Galloway at an old coal power station. So we'll add that on there as well. So there's a bit of a difference between policy in England and Scotland. Now, I'm not up on the England and Wales policies, but I've put in there nationally significant infrastructure, which is, we think, being consulted on at the moment. But that's not something that affects Scotland because that is about their planning system. In Scotland, we, as you know, have National Planning Framework 4. We're going to hear a bit more about that with Nikki in a bit. And the thing that pertains to data centres here in Scotland is that National Development 12, which is the digital fibre network, has green data centres as part of that. And it's difficult to know what exactly that means because we don't have a definition for green data centres. But what a national development is each national planning framework that comes along, there are some developments laid out that are deemed to be important for Scotland. And of course, the digital fibre network is one. And so this would help the digital fibre network to get smoothly through planning processes in order to be able to connect up all the houses. And somehow the green data centres got onto that as part of that national development. And then there's some areas which cross across Scotland and England and Wales. And you've got the AI growth zones. So we've got one in Scotland that has been declared in Lanarkshire at the moment. There are currently, I think, 5 across the UK. That isn't necessarily the end of them designated, and there may be others designated. It's not yet clear what that entails. We've been told that it would make it easier to get planning permission, but how that works with Scotland's planning system, that's difficult to know. The government have also said it'd be easier to get a connection to the grid. Now, I've put there also something that spans both is NESO Ofgem and the grid. So the sort of processes by which grid connections happen is obviously joint between the two. And that at the moment is being consulted on and changes are being made to allow more rapid connections and prioritisation for certain developments, including data centres. So that's a live consultation at the moment, I think. So on to the AI growth zone. There's one which is there. I see where it says it's number 2 and 3 over there. This is Lanarkshire. And I just wanted to show you this picture because it's a great surprise to me to find that a lot of the data centre planned across the Glasgow area, I actually walked over the top of during a long walk that I did around the green belts of Glasgow when I first started to be the APRS director and thought I'd find out what a green belt was. And when I traced my route, I was incredibly surprised to find that even those data centres proposed that aren't on green belts around Glasgow, I actually walked over the tops of each of the sites. So you can see there Drumshangi Moss at the top, and there's the one in the AI growth zone in the middle there at Newhouse. Ravenscraig, I went through Ravenscraig, and then I went down to just outside Hamilton as well and walked across the one that's proposed down there. So I wanted to show you that just to show you how much within Greenbelt some of these are. And what we're seeing is a lot of them, including those, the one Dunbar, Ayrshire, all sorts of places, are on these greenfield sites. And that is because they need a lot of land. And the remediation costs of brownfield sites are very high. And so, of course, you make more money if you can put them onto greenfields or greenbelt sites where you don't have those kind of costs and the land is very cheap. That's just a quick map of some of the sites of the AI growth zone. But I think that's the end of my presentation, which I better stop because I'm running out of voice and pass you on to Nikki. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Kat. I'll just hopefully share my screen successfully. Hopefully that's okay. Right. I'm going to talk about data centres and the Scottish planning system. So the planning process in Scotland for data centres is pretty much as it is for other types of development. So we'll quickly look at the stages of applications and talk about writing objections a bit. I'll mention some of the terminology in NPF4 that might give data centres a slightly different status. And really the arrival of hyperscale data centres in the planning system is so new that there is still some uncertainty about all of this. Part of that is because of the way planning regulations and policies operate. And it is partly the difficulty of understanding the potential impacts of this relatively new technology and the current proposals to deploy it at such a huge scale, as Kat's mentioned. And then probably the most useful thing today for campaigners is to point out sources of advice and guidance that you can refer to. And we will circulate links to them afterwards to everybody who's come tonight, or maybe even put them in the chat later. So if you are totally new to planning and you want a gentle introduction to how the planning system works, there's an advice note on the APRS website that's a good starting point. It explains how development management, the process that deals with planning applications, fits into the wider system. And more specifically about planning applications, we thoroughly recommend these guides from Planning Democracy. They're written for non-planners, written by non-planners for community use, but with expert planning input. And Guide 1 takes you through how to find out what you need to write a really good objection letter. And Guide 2 gives you all the background to the way decisions are made and how you can engage with planning. So it covers everything in much more detail than I can today. So I do recommend having a look at those. So a bit of context for hyperscale data centers, we're basically looking at applications for very big buildings like the one Kat showed you a picture of, or a series of buildings, which means that they will be classed as major development. So rather than smaller local development, say like an extension or a development of a few houses. If the proposal is considered to meet the definition of a green data center, it would fall into the category of national developments that Kat mentioned. The category in the hierarchy of development means that the process of application is handled slightly differently by planning authorities compared to local developments. But even for national developments, full planning permission and all consents are still required. So having that status is not a free pass on the planning process. There are Also likely to be associated developments to do with the grid connections and power sources, or associated renewables and battery storage, perhaps. Some of this might be included in the same planning application, or it might be in separate applications. So a bit of detective work might be in order to find out about that. Development management is the process by which proposed development may receive planning permission from the local council, the local planning authority. And councils are legally required to make decisions on planning applications in line with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So in Scotland, the development plan for a particular location comprises the National Planning Framework 4, NPF 4, and the Local Development Plan, the LDP, for that area. The Scottish Government has repeatedly emphasised its determination for Scotland to implement a plan-led planning system. And this means that if a piece of land is allocated for development, for housing or industry, say, in the LDP, there is a presumption in favour of its development for the purpose specified. But if it's not allocated, there is generally a presumption against development. The planning policies set out in both the NPF 4 and the relevant LDP will also have a bearing on decisions. Scottish Government have also made it very clear that they expect decision makers to read NPF 4 as a whole, but in each case, some policies will be more relevant and to be given more weight in the decision making than others. So going to the application process. First of all, pre-application. This is the early part of the development management process, and where the majority of the big data centre proposals we know about in Scotland are at. Developers will be notifying the planning authority that they're going to put in a planning application and finding out if they need to do an EIA, an environmental impact assessment. Some major developments require EIAs if it's anticipated that they may have significant environmental impacts, and an EIA screening request will appear on the local authority planning portal online with background information reports about the development provided by the applicants, the developers. Local authority planners then issue a screening opinion which says if an EIA is required or not. Even if it's not required, planning applications can still be rejected on environmental grounds later. However, doing an EIA should mean having much more information about environmental impacts up front in the process, which is generally a good thing. So the local authority will also, about the same time, be formally notified of a major application via a proposal of application notice, or a PAN. This also will be on the local authority planning portal, and it sets out how the developer will fulfil requirements for pre-application public consultation. They have to do this, but it is important to realise, if you participate in that comments made by the public at the consultation are not formal objections, and they won't be considered as such at the point the planning permission is decided. Your feedback in the consultation might inform and influence the developer's final application, but some consultations feel more genuine than others, I'd say. And also the final plans can vary from what is set out in the consultation stage. So don't assume, having looked at it at that stage, that the final application will be the same. And we'd say really view the consultation primarily as an opportunity to get information about proposals and then to get organised. And one extra thing to mention, committee reports. They're a potentially helpful source of information. They're reports to the council committees at this stage. So locally, you can keep an eye out for these. As an example, for the 2 proposed data centre applications in Edinburgh, the council's sustainability committee sought information about environmental aspects of data centres back in last autumn. So that was well ahead of the first Guile application going to committee for consideration in January this year. And for the second Edinburgh application at Hermiston, which is at pre-application stage now, a paper about the forthcoming application went to Edinburgh's planning committee this week. So that was really to give councillors a heads up about the likely key issues. So that's actually also a useful source of info for the public, and it might point you to which policies you need to focus on in the LDP and the MPF4. And just want to emphasise, it's really useful to get ahead and be familiar with relevant bits of the local development plan and with MPF4 policies before the application goes in, as there's usually not much time at all once it has been submitted, the planning application has been submitted, to get your arguments sorted out. Anyway, when it does go in, it's put up on the online portal with the data validation and a case reference, and always use that in any correspondence. Do tell people about it. Neighbour notification will have to happen, but it's not always very effective, especially in rural areas. If you have a community council, talk to them. They might be considering objecting, and they might just be able to publicise it as well. Do find out the deadline for public comments and objections. If it's not obvious on the portal, ask the planning officer, and their contact details should be on the portal too. They might be called the case officer. The minimum period for commenting is only 3 weeks. And actually in the guile, you can see in the green there, I think it was only 22 days. So sometimes it can be longer, but don't assume that. Do check. And if you need to, you can contact the planning officers about the process, or if you think information is perhaps missing from the application. Sometimes not all reports related to the application are submitted or made public at once, which can make things quite difficult. Also want to point out the type of application can vary. It may be full planning permission or a staged application with in-principle planning permission, so less detailed plans, and then there'll be a further detailed application later. Different authorities handle them differently and give them slightly different names. So if it's not clear, ask the planners. If planning in principle is granted, then there'll be a further detailed full application or something called an approval of matters specified in conditions later on. The Edinburgh Guile application was an in principle one, so PPP in the code there. The other Edinburgh forthcoming application has been referred to in that council paper that I put up as a slide as detailed, so presumably it is going to be an application for full planning permission. Do scrutinise the information on the portal and write your objection on the information, referring to the information on the portal, but usually there's an awful lot of it. There were 70 plus documents for that Guile application, and that was without an EIA. You can, of course, read them all if you want to and have time, but if not, perhaps first check the location map and the proposed layout and the planning statement. And that should give the developers overview of what they're proposing. And then you can look at any supplementary reports which seem most important. So for the Guile, there was an energy and sustainability report which showed all the potential backup diesel turbines that weren't really highlighted in the planning statement. But you might want to check the building design or the air quality report or the noise assessment, which trees they're planning to remove from the site, or ecological reports, whatever seems most important. And obviously if an EIA has been done, there'll be a big environmental report too. So do refer to those or points in those reports in your objection. Do submit your letter of objection by the deadline via the online portal if you can, but email and paper should be options too. You should get an acknowledgement, and then it should be listed on the public portal. And then once it's in, you have time to lobby your councillors and make them aware of concerns and objections before the decision is made. Be aware that councillors have a code of conduct, and if they are likely to be involved in the decision on the planning permission, they cannot be seen to prejudge it beforehand. So they should be open to hearing their constituents' concerns, but don't expect them to take a view on it at that stage. Right, when it comes to this decision, a case report by the local authority planners is usually available 5 working days before the committee meeting. Sometimes it goes on the planning portal, but often it's just in papers for the committee meeting at which the application will be decided. So unless your local planning officer or a helpful counsellor is updating you, watch out for the committee date on the portal. Usually committee dates are listed under important dates on the portal page for the case, and then you can cross-check with the local authority's online committee meeting schedule of dates and the meeting papers, and hopefully find the paper when it comes out. If the report comes out and recommends approval, do let your councillors know that you disagree and why. At least email your ward councillors and the ones on the relevant committees. Major applications and national developments are decided at public meetings, so they're not delegated to officers like some local development decisions. Sometimes, especially for national developments, a predetermination hearing meeting is held, sort of just to go through the details of the case a bit before the final meeting. And arrangements can vary between local authorities, but objectors may have an opportunity to speak at that. And you can also ask to speak at the committee meeting deciding the application. There might be a limit on numbers, and it might be first come, first serve, and you'll only get a few minutes, but certainly worth doing. And if you don't want to speak, you might be able to ask your ward councillors if they can speak on your behalf. And also on the day, you can go along and watch from the public gallery or watch the meeting online. So at the actual meeting, after presentations from the developers and objectors and probably a long discussion, the decision will be taken by councillors voting. If permission is approved, there will have been a discussion of planning conditions which are intended to make a development more acceptable in various ways. I'm not going to go into that now, but they can be quite important afterwards. If the application is approved, there's no right for the community or third parties to appeal the decision within the planning system. It's why it's so crucial to get organised well in advance of the deadline for objections and make your arguments against the development at that point, because you might not really have another chance. And I wanted to mention call-in powers. Given that some of these developments are being termed national developments, or they might be anyway, it's worth being aware that the Scottish Government does have the power to call in a planning application and determine it themselves. That's relatively unusual, but worth being aware of given that these are potentially big, high-profile projects. And then after the decision is taken, the decision notice will go up on the public planning portal. If the application has been rejected, developers can appeal, and they have 6 weeks in which to do so. So sometimes you just have to wait and see if they decide to or not. There is a cost attached to that now. There used not to be. And if an appeal happens, all the information about that will go on to the DPA website. And if you objected to the application, you usually get notified by email that that's happened. Yeah, this is just the DPA webpage. It's a portal like a planning portal, but just for planning appeals and other types of cases handled by the DPA, which is part of Scottish Government. Anyway, hopefully appeals are a way off. We don't think that the Guile application has been appealed. So, writing objections. The law states that planning decisions must be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations state otherwise. All too often, planning decisions are not that straightforward. An application may accord with the development plan in some respects while being contrary to other parts of the development plan. So there are usually competing interests, perhaps between environmental protection, societal needs, and economic interests. Decision makers have to weigh all that up. So be aware of that. But when you write an objection, try to relate your arguments to your local development plan and NPF4 if you can, because it should make them stronger. Don't just write, I object to this development, because that won't have much impact. And then be aware that other material considerations will potentially influence the final decision, things not covered in planning policy. So potentially the AI growth zone and various other government strategies might have an impact too. What is considered material will vary on each case, but we can provide a link to further information about what generally is and isn't considered material. An example of an LDP. They're a combination of a written statement with proposals and policies and maps which set out what should happen where. So you should be able to find yours online. This map shows the map bit of this shows the Edinburgh Gyle planning application site. It's one of the purple blobs. And it was included in a proposal in the local development plan for a mix of business and residential use. So definitely not for data centres and not even for just industry. For other locations, look at the LDP to find out if the site is allocated for development of any sort or designated in the LDP as greenbelt or for other uses, because these will point to which policies are likely to be most influential or carry much weight in the decision. And you don't need to wait for the application to go in to do this, of course. So LDPs also contain interactive proposal maps online. This is the one for Southwest Edinburgh. And if you zoom into that map, you can see the Wester Hermiston site for the other proposed data centre in Edinburgh. It's that strip of land with the green dots covering it, north of the section with the blue diagonal lines. So the green dots equal designated greenbelt. The brown edge marking is around a special landscape area. The orange hatching at the top of the site is a local nature conservation site. It's the Union Canal, and that is also a scheduled ancient monument signified by the black circles. And the red line area is a conservation area to the east. So all of these things potentially bring different policies into the decision-making frame and identify some policies worth referencing in an objection. They will probably all be mentioned in the developer's planning application and background resorts, but you may feel that they are rather glossed over or slightly dismissed in those documents. This is a picture of MPF4. It contains 33 national planning policies, so they apply across the country, many of which will be relevant to each application. So MPF4 was adopted in Scotland in 2023, and its focus on climate and biodiversity was quite a shift from what went before. There's also various annexes. There's a glossary and also an annex that sets out the national development statements of need. But given the amount of energy in particular that hyperscale data centres look likely to use, the climate policies in MPF4 are likely of prime importance. And that was certainly considered to be the case in the Gyle decision. So this is the first policy. It's an overarching policy in MPF4. And it says, when considering all development proposals, significant weight will be given to the global climate and nature crises. And also policy 2, proposals need to be designed to minimise life cycle greenhouse gas emissions as far as possible. So the government's actually published extra guidance on this just before Christmas, so that might be helpful. But surely will be important in all these decisions. Other policies, data centres aren't mentioned specifically in, I don't think, any of the policies, but some policies will likely be seen as supportive of them. So this is policy 24, digital infrastructure, and you might be able to see paragraph A gives support to appropriate, universal and future-proofed digital infrastructure, which possibly could apply to some data centres. That will be part of the decision-making process. Kat mentioned National Development 12. MPF4 sets out these statements of need for each of the national developments. Green data centres are there. But as Kat said, I think that it doesn't define what green data centres are. So the Scottish Government has used the term elsewhere, but it hasn't given specific guidance on this. It's leaving that to decision makers on individual cases, so the local planning authorities. So if a data centre is not deemed a green data centre, it wouldn't be a national development. National development status means that the need for this sort of development has been established, therefore giving it some support in the planning process, but it hasn't specified where in Scotland they should go. And as I said, national development applications still have to be assessed against all the planning policies, including the climate ones. And there's also some other considerations. There's the same protections exist for European nature sites, and that might be relevant to places like the site in the Lammermuirs. And this is just an extract from the Giles decision, and it was really just to illustrate that the rejection of this application was because of a mixture of NPF4 policies to do with the climate emergencies, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, a place policy from the local development plan, and the fact that Edinburgh Council didn't consider it to be a green data centre. So that's why they rejected it. Another bit of terminology from NPF4. In the glossary, they have the term essential infrastructure, and that includes digital communications infrastructure. So whether every data centre can be considered essential is probably debatable, but the NPF4 policies where essential infrastructure is mentioned and potentially supported include soils, greenbelt, coastal development, flood risk and water management. So each of those deals with essential infrastructure differently, but for greenbelts, policy 8, which will be relevant to many of the proposed data centre sites, it says that the development of essential infrastructure can be supported, but the development has to meet various criteria. And just to illustrate this, that's a photo of a bit of North Lanarkshire greenbelt where a planning application for a data centre is expected before long. That's another photograph of the same data centre that we visited last week. But this is an extract from Policy 8, and it shows the criteria that have to be met for support to be given to a greenbelt site. So it includes the proposal being compatible with the surrounding countryside and the land character. It's appropriate scale, massing and external appearance, no significant long-term impacts on environmental quality of the greenbelt. So councillors will have to decide if a data centre much bigger than that could meet those requirements, but you can probably draw your own conclusions too. And we have a specific advice note about greenbelts, which we can point you to if that's relevant to your the data centre that you're interested in. Yes, and finally, sources of advice and information that we will let you have: the data centre map, various advice notes and information about planning on our website, planning democracies guides, ERCS, Ben will talk about, but they have really good guidance on EIAs. There's some government information about different policies, and other organisations also have helpful information too. But I'm going to hand you back to Kat now.
Thank you very much, Nikki. That was really, really interesting and incredibly in depth. And I feel like I'm really glad we're recording this so that we can all go and watch it again. I'm going to pass straight over to Ben now from ERCS, who'll give us something from the point of view of he's a solicitor with Environmental Rights Centre Scotland. They've just established a law firm there, which he's leading, and he has a particular skill set and useful point of view on this kind of issue, partly because they were involved in writing to Edinburgh City Council about the Hermiston and the Gyle data centre developments because they didn't require an EIA. So I'll hand over to you now, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kat. Hello, everyone. Bear with me while I get my slides set up here. Hopefully that should be showing on your screens now. Kat or Nikki, could you just nod your head if that looks okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm Ben. I work as the Principal Solicitor and Legal Director at the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. As Kat helpfully said there, we recently set up a law firm in December last year, and we provide free legal advice and legal representation, i.e. in court, on public interest environmental matters. We've done a fair bit of work now on data centres, which seems to be one of the kind of new areas of work that keeps coming to us, thanks to the Scottish Government's policy on this. So my presentation for maybe 15 to 20 minutes is going to be in two parts. I'm going to talk about EIAs, environmental impact assessments, and how they relate to data centres. Nikki's kind of helpfully given us an introduction to that topic already. I'm going to go into a bit more depth. And then I'm going to finish in part two by just giving you some general tips about going to court over planning matters. Sometimes an objection isn't enough, and you might want to challenge a planning decision in court. So, part one, data centres and EIAs. I'm going to look at what an EIA is, when they're needed, something called screening opinions, and focus a little bit in particular on whether EIAs are required for data centres. It's a bit of a new area, so something of a debate there. What is an EIA then? Environmental impact assessment. It's essentially a procedure, as Nikki said, that is meant to ensure that a decision maker, such as a council deciding a planning application, deciding whether to grant a planning application, is fully informed of the environmental consequences of their decision. And EIAs, as I'll come on to, are only really needed for high impact developments that are going to have a significant effect on the environment. So it's a procedure really for ensuring that comprehensive assessment is made of any proposed development before they get the go-ahead. And that's why it's kind of often described as a tool, not a rule. It doesn't guarantee any decision. It doesn't guarantee that a development won't go ahead, but it's supposed to make sure that decisions are well informed. And it does that by requiring a developer, when an EIA is required, to produce an EIA report, which is meant to be a really comprehensive report looking at the environmental consequences of a development. They also come with lots of public participation requirements, so that report has to be published. Members of the public have to be given the opportunity to comment on it. I think they get a little bit longer than they do with planning applications to comment on EIA reports. Those comments then have to be taken into account along with what is actually said in the EIA report by the council when they make a decision on that planning application. And it should result in much better informed decision making. And those 2017 regulations set out basically the law on environmental impact assessments in Scotland. So when are they required? Only for developments with significant or potentially significant environmental impacts. The EIA regulations kind of split those into two categories. So we've got Schedule 1 developments where EIAs are always mandatory. And that's kind of massive infrastructure projects that include things like nuclear power stations, airports, huge roads, etc. Then where things get a bit more interesting and where we often get involved are, for Schedule 2 developments, where the council has to make an assessment as to whether an EIA is required. And that can include things like large housing developments or data centres, as we'll come on to. So I'm going to look a little bit look a little bit at Schedule 2 developments and kind of what happens there. Schedule 2 developments have to be screened for EIA, and that means the council has to come to an informed and reasoned decision on whether an EIA is needed. Nikki mentioned that these are published on the planning portal. The council has a duty to publish these screening opinions, and they can be of really varying quality. Some councils do a pretty good, thorough job of them. Some councils do trying to remain diplomatic, because I'm reminding myself that we're being recorded, but not such a good job of them. So yeah, they're of a varying quality. This is what the EIA regulations say they have to contain. So they have to be in writing. You have to provide reasons, and those reasons have to be with reference to a set of criteria set out in Schedule 3 of those regulations. And when the council has decided an EIA is not required in their screening opinion, there's this little feature of the EIA regulations, which is often forgotten, which says the screening opinion has to state any features or proposed measures intended to avoid or prevent significant adverse effects on the environment. So there has to be some kind of statement about mitigating the environmental effect of the development. That's often missed out. This is a little extract of Schedule 3, just to give you an idea of the types of factors that have to be taken into account. So the size and design of the development, that's kind of pretty obvious. Production of waste, pollution, and nuisances. These are all relevant factors when we're thinking about data centres. And this is an example of a not very good screening opinion. This is the original screening opinion from Edinburgh Council for the South Gyle data centre. And this is basically, this is an extract from the screening opinion, but this is basically the reasons they gave why an EIA was not required. And I don't think you need to be a lawyer to realise that this is very generic and is deeply unsatisfactory as a statement of reasons as to why an EIA was not required. I mean, you could transpose those bullet points onto pretty much any development. It doesn't appear to have considered the particular features of the South Gyle data centre at all. Coming to the end of part 1 and thinking about whether EIAs are required for data centres, I'm going to give you a bit of a lawyer's answer to that one, which is it depends. I don't think they're Schedule 1 developments, although there might be room for saying that they are Schedule 1 developments if the data centre is of a certain size. So I think it might be arguable if a data centre development has over 300 megawatts of combustion installations. And that might include the backup generators that are often part of these developments. They're probably Schedule 2 developments. They generally, the types of developments, at least Kat was talking about, kind of hyperscale data centers, they tend to be quite large. They tend to have a fairly large geographical footprint. And if they're above half a hectare in size, then they're probably Schedule 2 developments, which means they have to be screened. And I think screening opinions for all data centers should address all of the following impacts, potential impacts of data centers. It's kind of already been covered that they can have a significant impact on the climate. They often come with backup generators, which can create significant air pollution and noise pollution. They can use a lot of water. They can also use a lot of land. They can have an impact on the local environment depending on what's there and what the site is like where they're going to be built. There might be site-specific issues that have to be taken into account. For the South Gyle data centre, the council's planning documents indicated that the site was contaminated land because of the presence, I think, of giant hogweed. That doesn't seem to have made its way into any decision or really into any of the council's decision making, but there we go. And there might be scope for saying that risk of major accidents needs to be considered, particularly if there's going to be a lot of fuel stored on site for the backup generators. So those are my thoughts on what screening opinions should include for data centers. And that's the end of part one. Part two, and with a bit of a kind of a segue, there are multiple points for at which you might consider going to court over data center proposals. And those might include a decision by a council to grant planning permission for a data center. That's something that you could potentially go to court over. And a screening opinion which says no EIA is required. Those are two examples of data center related decisions that you might want to take legal advice on. So part two, I'm going to look at a couple of different things. Grounds of challenge, so why you can take something to court, the time limits that apply, costs, because that's one of the big barriers people often come up against, and just a couple of other miscellaneous practicalities to have a think about. Grounds of challenge. Oh, there are so many grounds of challenge, but these are the three main headings that you're thinking about when you're challenging a planning decision. So the first one is illegality. Someone has not complied with the law. That could be something as simple as the council's failed to produce a screening opinion when it had a legal duty to do so. Irrationality. This is a really difficult one to be successful in court over. It requires you to persuade a court that a decision maker made a decision that was so unreasonable that no reasonable person could ever have made it, which is a pretty high threshold to get over. So you're talking about up is down, black is white territory. Data centers don't use any energy. Data centers don't have any impacts on the climate, that kind of thing. Procedural impropriety is really just there's some defect in the process leading up to the ultimate decision. This is an example of a case that I was involved in, that I worked on, which was a successful legal challenge against Murray Council, who decided to grant planning permission for a luxury housing development on a small piece of woodland outside of Portessie, contrary to the local development plan. And we challenged that and were successful, and the court said there had been illegality there because the council decided to grant planning permission on the basis that a couple of luxury houses would result in a small increase to the school roll, and the court said that's not a material consideration. So that is an example of a successful legal challenge. Time limits. Time limits are really important. The main thing to take away, if you ignore all of this detail, is as soon as a decision comes out that you are concerned about and you'd like legal advice on, get advice as soon as possible. Contact us for advice, because the time limits to challenge planning decisions are really short. It can be either within 6 weeks of the council's decision notice or within 3 months of the decision notice. And it's probably not worth going into which is which. It's there on the slides, but basically the time limits are really short. And if you miss those time limits, well, you might be able to persuade a court in some circumstances that the time limit should be extended, but you need to have a really good reason to do that. And in some cases, you just can't extend the time limit at all. Costs, right. One of the biggest barriers to going to court over planning matters is how much it costs. It's a fairly expensive game. You need to instruct solicitors and an advocate for planning litigation because it's heard in the court of session. And costs can be 4 figures and 5 figures quite easily. So understandably, that puts a lot of people off. Here are a few things that you can think about to try and make going to court over a planning issue a bit more affordable. If there's someone who might be eligible for legal aid, and that's someone on a really kind of low to medium income or in receipt of some form of social security like universal credit, they might be eligible for legal aid. If you're really lucky and you know maybe you're friends with an advocate who will do it for free, then absolutely great, but those cases are quite rare. You can get what's called a protective expenses order in your case, which limits your liability to the other side if you lose, because the general rule in going to court over planning matters is if you lose, you have to pay your own legal costs and your opponent's legal costs. But a protective expenses order is designed to cap your liability to the other side. And sometimes you can get a cap at 0. So if you lose, you don't have to pay any of your opponent's costs. Crowdfunding is a relatively new thing in Scotland, but it seems to be becoming more and more prevalent and more successful. Crowdfunding basically refers to setting up a kind of a page for your case on a crowdfunding website and asking lots of people to give you lots of small donations to your case. The best example I could find of this in Scotland is this case involving Scottish wildcats, where they've managed to raise 400 grand. I think that's quite difficult. It's pretty difficult to raise that kind of sum of money in most cases, and they've really been helped by being able to use lots of cute wildcat photos. But thousands and tens of thousands of pounds are not unheard of. So it's definitely an option and something to think about if the costs put you off. Some other miscellaneous practicalities to think about. You need to find legal representation. So I've mentioned that we provide legal representation, so you're very welcome to contact us if this is something that you're thinking about. We can also point you in the direction of other firms that do this sort of work. Get hold of all the relevant documents that you can as soon as possible if you're challenging a planning decision. So if there's anything that you think should have been published that hasn't been published, maybe a document that's referred to in a planning officer's report that's not in the planning portal, put in a freedom of information request and get hold of those documents as soon as possible, because they could be really important. And if you're involved in a group which is opposed to a planning application or a data center proposal, then you might need to find an individual to take on a case, because if you're an unincorporated community group, that group won't be able to litigate in its name. It doesn't have what's called legal personality, and you'll need some individuals who are willing to take on the case. Or some other group that is kind of formally constituted. So those are some things to think about. And I'm just going to finish with a little plug to a couple of our guides here. Nikki has kindly already mentioned our guide on EIAs. We've also got a guide to judicial reviews, which covers a lot of Part 2. And I think I've said it enough. You can contact us if you want legal advice, free legal advice and representation. Thank you. Back to you, Kat.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was absolutely fantastic. Yes, I think the funding's a big mountain to climb for many groups, and often they're not always successful as well, so it can be extremely disheartening as well, can't it? We were aware of one recently that didn't achieve either its funding achievements or actually win, which I think was really difficult for them. So it's good to know what we're letting ourselves in for if we do take these kind of routes. So we've got loads of questions that have come in. So I'm going to kind of go through a few of them. So there was one about missing details in applications. So when there isn't the full impacts on climate, on environment, are not set out in these kind of planning permission and principles that are coming in, and what's the situation there and what can we do about that? I'm wondering, Nikki, what's the implication of that?
Well, it sort of depends. I mean, the Edinburgh Guile application was in principle, and there was so little detail in it, or hard and fast detail about what the environmental impacts would be and how they would manage them or mitigate them, that actually the councillors seem to see through that and say, we can't call this a green data centre, and we think it risks Edinburgh meeting net zero targets, and so we're not going to approve it. And part of that decision was definitely on climate grounds. So you could say that the planning permission in principle and the lack of detail meant it didn't get approved. If it's a full planning permission and there's detail not there, that's also problematic. If it's missing, you can ask the council if they've got it and they just haven't put it on the portal. That might be one thing. There, you can FOI things, as Ben was talking about, but do it early. And if it really comes down to it, you could also just point out to the councillors that it's missing and it's inadequate. And how can you judge what a data centre's impact's going to be if the information about how it's going to be run and what systems it's going to use? And that just seems logical to me. How can you approve it if you don't know what its impact is going to be? But Ben might have a different view on that.
I think you've covered mostly everything I would have said there, Nikki. There are particular rules about what documents have to go on the planning portal, and I cannot remember them off the top of my head. So if there's a particular query that someone has about an individual case, you're welcome to contact us for advice, and I will dig out those rules and give you a better answer.
Yeah, I think this is a particular difficulty for data center applications specifically, because they're often applying in order to sell it on to a third party. And so they deliberately leave it vague because they know that the fit out, and in fact, a lot of the things that are going to influence the water use, the electricity use, are actually all in the decisions that they want to leave open to the final the person who's going to be ending up fitting it out. So actually, this is probably likely to be very common across applications. I've got a question for Ben about so are there times when EIAs can be biased? Like, who writes the EIA, and can it be inaccurate or biased in any way? And what happens if it is?
Yeah, it can. One of the, or I suppose the main flaw of the EIA process is it requires developers to provide a report on the environmental consequences of a development. And developers, as you would imagine, have an interest in downplaying the environmental significance of their development so that their developments get planning permission. There are kind of rules that are meant to mitigate that. So EIA reports are meant to be written by experts with particular technical competences. And I suppose the the whole EIA process, the kind of public participation requirements that I mentioned, should help to flush out any biases, because members of the public will be able to read the reports and then comment on them and say, no, actually, I think this is all complete rubbish. This data center is going to use lots of energy, contrary to what's said in your report, etc. But yeah, no, it is a problem, and I suppose you have to treat them with a degree of caution, the EIA reports.
Thank you, Ben. Just a really quick one to you, actually. Someone was clarifying about the EIAs. Is it about the size of the development itself, or just the size of the actual building? Because it'll have an outline of the development, and that half a hectare, which of those does it include?
Well, looking back at Schedule 3 on the slides, it's the size and design of the development.
So the whole outline of it. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got a question that came in advance from somebody asking about whether there's any way the planning system can take an account of the data that could be stored and processed in these data centers. I mean, could they say, this shouldn't be allowed for deep fake stuff or illegal things and all the rest of it, or is that just up to whoever's using the data center?
I don't think it's in the scope of planning to be able to control that. When we were talking earlier, I did mention that the government strategy on digital, whatever, I can't remember, digital policy or whatever it is, did talk about digital infrastructure all having an ethical basis and being very green, but the government's about to change, and I'm not sure that anybody can interpret that in terms of planning and what could be allowed. Unfortunately not. I think not in planning anyway. Presumably there could be legal requirements, but that's not the planning system, I think.
And these data centers are
to that?
Oh yes, Ben.
I mean, even if it did, how would we know? Like, how would you know what a data center is being used for? I think that would be pretty difficult to enforce. But I agree with Nikki. I don't think it's within the scope of planning.
That's another question. There's a couple of community councillors here, and they've got a question about how much weight does their opinion hold, because they're told that community councils have a sort of an opinion and it will be listened to, but they don't feel like that is the case. Nikki, do you want to start, and we'll go on to Ben afterwards?
Well, I'll have a go. I think community councils that are up and running do have to be notified about planning applications in their area. So I suppose there are a way of spreading the word about what's happening. Obviously, they can then put in an objection or a comment or whatever. Some community councils put in supportive comments about some proposals. How councillors and planning committees and planning officers weigh up the weight of a community council objection, I don't know is the answer. They do usually mention it in the planning reports, so I think it must carry some weight. Presumably a lot of it comes down to what they're actually saying in their objection, though, and so Ben might know more about the actual regulations, but I would see community councils definitely as a way of spreading the word in the area, though.
I agree with that. As far as I know, community councils don't have the views of community councils don't have any special weight in planning law. There's no requirement for the council, when it's determining a planning application, to kind of give community councils' opinions any special preference. But all objections have to be taken into account. All material considerations that are raised in objections have to be taken into account. And from the kind of interactions that I've had with councillors, they do seem to, I mean, I get the sense that they take community councils pretty seriously, particularly the ones who are more diligent and go to meetings of community councils and actually interact with them. I don't think they would just be completely ignoring your opinions, and probably in reality, the opinions of community councils are being taken more seriously than other objections.
Thanks, Ben. Quick question. Where can you, people are able to attend council deliberations, and how do they find out about it?
Well, I think everywhere. Certainly, I looked this up for Edinburgh recently. You can just turn up on the day. If you find out where the council committee meeting is happening, you turn up at the venue, say that you at reception that you want to go to the meeting, and you should just be signed in and be able to sit and listen and watch. Most of them are streamed live as well. You won't be able to speak if you do that, but you'd have to, if you want to speak as an objector, you need to arrange that beforehand.
Great. I've got a couple of technical questions here. It was about the typical electrical load profile over 24 hours. So I think from what we've been looking up, it's between 80 and 85% of the kind of headline they tend to run on, and it depends on the training regime of the large language models, but I'm not a technical expert on that, so I think more reading will need to be done. And secondly, about whether there's any examples of where a data center has been properly integrated into a heat network. And we had a bit of a answer to this, didn't we, on our first webinar, which was Julie Bolthouse from Piedmont Environment Council in Virginia, who is very experienced in working with data centers. She's a planner as well, and she said that even though data center operators talked about heat networks all the time, there wasn't an example in Virginia, which has got the most data centers in the world, of a heat network from a data center actually happening.
So Kat, while you're coughing, I'll just say, and someone actually, Lisa's put it in the chat, Denmark and Finland, I was reading about just this week, having, I think they probably already had heat networks that they could put data centers into, or the heat from data centers into. So there are some up and running there, but the sort of commentary over that was data centers are still not good for the environment. This is just like a tiny part of the problem that we're using to do something slightly less worse with. But yeah, Scandinavia are doing heat networks.
I've got another question, which is about should we be concerned that there could be another national planning framework coming that could downgrade the importance of nature and climate? Because we're aware that National Planning Framework 4 has got a sort of nature and climate focus. Is that anything to worry about, or should we just worry about things that are closer?
Not immediately. It's meant to set out the sort of forward spatial strategy and policy to, I think it says to 2040 on it. I mean, it could be a new one could come out before that, and there is also the possibility that a government could change it. There are now regulations quite recently that would allow them to do that, but there would have to be a public consultation on that. And the process for producing NPF4 lasted many years. There was a big consultation exercises, there were drafts. There was also COVID, which meant it took even longer. But yeah, it won't happen. It shouldn't happen rapidly.
The Scottish Government has a duty to review it at least every 10 years. and I don't imagine there's any appetite to do it any earlier than they have to. It's a pretty giant process. There's a lot of consultation, and it doesn't seem likely to me.
Great. Well, I hope you can all watch any of the other webinars we've done on Catch Up. We did a whole series on the planning system, and it's really informative about National Planning Framework 4, and we did a whole one on biodiversity as well. So if there's issues around biodiversity near where you are, that will be one to watch too. And one on freedom of information as well, that was joint with ERCS. So thank you very much, everybody. I'll let you go to your evenings, and perhaps the speakers will stay on and say goodbye to each other at the end of this. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.